Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. We all know that this is one of the greatest acts of commitment and dedication to show up to the closing plenary, so we are very grateful. I saw some really vigorous nods. It needn't be that vigorous with your nodding. So we have, since being invited to do this, had 2 or 3 rounds of email discussions about how we wanted to approach this, tried on various kinds of approaches. We've had 2 lengthy discussions about it since we've been here. And quite frankly, we've got nothing. So we figured small group work. I kid. This is actually the question that we came to, that we wanted to address and that each of us will address, but we want to ask you to warm up a little bit and talk about it at your tables for just a few minutes. We started to think about SOTL as a practice, the scholarship of teaching and learning as a practice, right? And we are practitioners. And practices are always shaped by their conditions. And as conditions change, the conditions for practice change, and therefore practice itself changes. Sometimes conditions change that render practices more urgent and more important, and sometimes conditions change that render them obsolete. And sometimes practitioners are put in a position of having to recognize that actually they're actually more in this business than that business, and they need to start shifting their practices in one direction or another to survive changing conditions or risk, if not extinction, at least diminution. So this is the question we want to put to you. That's the question we want to put to you. What are the most important changing conditions for education, higher education, global or local, or both, that will shape the practice of SOTL over the next 10 years? Take 7 minutes to solve that. Take a few minutes to talk to people near you. What would be your initial answer in response to that question? Most important changing conditions that'll shape our practices over the next decade. Okay, thank you very much for engaging in that activity, and we'll be really eager to have a dialogue. Am I on, or you're just ignoring me because it's the last day of the conference and you're just doing whatever you want? We'll be really eager to engage with you as the session goes deeper, and I hope that the things that came out... Bring it right up to my mouth? Okay, how's that? No?
Can you tip it up?
Better? Well, thank you. That's all the time I have. And that is my answer to that question. While I was moving my lips, I was thanking you for engaging so seriously in that activity. And we'll be eager to hear from you and the things that came up at your table as the session goes on. We'd now like to just share very briefly, and perhaps with a little bit of conversation in between, but only a little bit, what our answers are, our own personal answers and responses are to thinking about that question. So I'll start. About a month ago, I attended a symposium that was put together by the United States Department of Education and the White House that was called Innovation to Drive Productivity in Post-Secondary Education. And I found it a profoundly disorienting experience. About 150 leaders of higher education and me were present, and I were present. And it was a whole range of people, but especially featured in the morning were the presidents of all these new massive online consortia and several startups and some other smart folks who have been doing some work for a long time. But Coursera, Udacity, edX, Newton, Straighterline, Pearson. I would say that the day was about three things: data, scale, and personalization of learning. I'm going to read you some things people said without ascribing them. We go very deep into the data for each student. We have millions of data points about students. I have 150,000 data points about your students that you don't have. We can personalize data about students down to the atomic concept level. We want to improve education dramatically in quality, efficiency, and scale. What we're about is reintegrating research on learning with practice through a virtuous cycle of design. Data to refine theories, theories to refine practices. This is the virtuous cycle. We have to have respect for the complexity of questions. Learning is complex, more complex than rocket science. We have to stop saying that these are easy things we can do. It's all about iteration and improvement based on student performance. We won't solve this in a year, but we have to turn teaching into a data-driven science. And on the other side of the tunnel, we are going to have something very exciting. So what I found disorienting in this conversation was whether I felt at home or alienated by this conversation. I've been doing work on technology-enhanced learning for my whole career, and I couldn't decide if I felt empowered or diminished by what was happening in this room. So I take that as a proxy for my question for the future of the scholarship of teaching and learning. And I'll just simply make this assertion that one of the most powerful forces on higher education over the next 10 years, maybe the most powerful, but I'll just say one of them, is going to be software. Software and data. Software that produces data from intelligent systems and adaptive systems and mastery-based systems, data that produces massive feedback that's read back into optimal learning designs, and personalized data trails on individual students. The question for SOTL is, if we take that as a changing condition for our practice, how will that change our practices? Okay? How will that change the scholarship of teaching and learning as a movement of practitioners? And I'm not merely speaking about us being able to do our individual work, but taking Harvey's point yesterday about influence. What does that say for the scholarship of teaching and learning potentially to have influence in this world driven by software and data that claims it's all about reading the data on student performance back into the improvement of designs? Three things that it makes me think about, very briefly. Will it make some of what we do obsolete? Are we doing some things by handicraft that are now being done by machine? And so if we think we're in the handicraft business, we're doomed. But is it a time to shift our focus to a different part of a spectrum that's already latent and to some extent present in what we do? Does it imply, for example, we should intensify our focus on the parts of learning that analytics can't capture because they happen outside of digital environments, outside the curriculum perhaps, or in high-impact integrative practices such as inquiry and research and students as change agents? Or does it imply, does it imply that maybe we think of SOTL as something, I don't think we really think of it right now, but as an integrator across a portfolio of assessments? That perhaps that's what we could bring to this learning conversation. All of those would imply that we would have to be players, deep players, in the world of learning analytics in order to be integrative of it with a larger vision. So in keeping with Harvey's notion of influence, I think it's important to look ahead and say, look at the possible changing forces, and how can we anticipate them, how can we strategize for them, and not merely be buffeted by them.
Do you want to say something for them? They might want to jot down a phrase or two from that to hold a question, Randy?
Software, data, extinction, discuss.
That's gorgeous. That's gorgeous. Thank you. Thank you. Randy made reference to implications for practice and how we can use practice to have influence. I'm going to take some of those 10,000-foot level points and questions and perhaps bring them down right to the ground. As I hear Randy speak, I wonder just what is meant by data. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to expand my view on that. In my own research, my research colleague and I conduct 1-hour interviews with second-year medical students. Those interviews are transcribed and we code them. Those become our data. I'm pretty sure you're talking about something that goes beyond that. So how might I use data in my work to help with some of the things that happen on a day-to-day basis? That's what I'm asking you. My work. Like some of you, for over 20 years, I worked in the educational development, academic development, faculty development business. So it was my job to do what I could to help enhance teaching and learning across a very large campus. I now work in one academic unit, the School of Population and Public Health. It has 67 faculty members. It's a graduate school. It has 370 graduate students. I'm the associate director of the school, and my job, and I have a job description, by the way, for the first time in my life. I find that reassuring on the one hand and really annoying on another. My job description says I am to help enhance the learning experience for those 370 students. And no one's telling me how to do it. It's fantastic. It's a great gig. Between that and the medical education research that I'm able to do, it's a great gig. For the most part, I don't know if you'd be surprised to find this, perhaps in some ways in stark contrast to the world that Randy encounters and sometimes thinks about. Most of my work takes the form of one-on-one, face-to-face conversations with other people. Really old-fashioned stuff. Gary, have you got a minute? Oh, Gary, I was meaning to talk to you. Gary, we need to set up a time to get together. There's a couple of things I need to run by you. That sort of stuff. Great, great privilege. As much as you've always got your day planned already, but never mind. Gary, can I just take a minute? Something's come up. Sure, I'll change the names. Sure, Sally, what's up? Well, you know that I chair our thesis screening panel, and all of our PhD students have to have their thesis proposal presented to what we call TSP, the thesis screening panel, and we provide input for them and for their committees. And it's a necessary rite of passage for PhDs, yeah. You know also that we have students in our school studying and doing research all over the world. Well, we've got one student in South Africa just now, and she wants to present to the thesis screening panel via Skype. Well, says Sally, I don't think it's reasonable to require her to fly home, but I'm really worried about her presenting via Skype. What's up? Well, you learn a lot when you watch someone present their work. There are nonverbal cues that give you some very, very good indicators of whether or not they're comfortable with where they are. I'm pretty sure this is the first time we've talked about this in the school. nonverbal cues that tell you something. Data. What do you think about that, Gary? Well, Sally, look at the time. Off goes Sally, and I decide a walk around the building is in order. And as I'm walking around the building, someone comes up to me and says, Gary, I was hoping I'd bump into you. I've got something I just wanted to run by you. You know I teach and Anne gives me a course number. She said, that's a required course, as you know, of all of, in this case, again, our PhD students. Yeah, and so it should be, Anne, I say. And she said, well, you know also, we've got students doing research all over the world. Oh. And we've got one in South Africa. Does she want to take your course by Skype? Whoa! Have you been talking with her? No. Well, she said the plot thickens. We've got 2 in Uganda, 1 in Cuba, and 2 in Ecuador. Right? They want to take the course via Skype. They're concerned about time zones, Anne. No. They'll be up at any time, day or night, to take the course. I'm concerned. There are 30 students in the class. 5 of them would be disembodied heads on a laptop. I think something would be lost there. And I need to talk to you about that because we encourage our students to go to these places. How are they doing there? Oh, fine, I think. How do you know? Well, our university designates various areas of the world according to safety codes. And these students are in a low safety code zone, and we have to talk to them every day via satellite cell phone, and we have to give them one. Okay. So those are 2. That happened in the same morning. I went into my office and closed the door and hoped that I didn't get another Skype question just yet. I use Skype all the time, as many of you do. But here's my question to you. As someone here who is deeply committed to SOTL, to data of one form or another, to learning from the literature, what guiding principles might I call upon to help me talk with Sally and Anne and the growing number of students who are going around the world because we want them to, and we still require courses of them? By the way, we do have distance learning or online versions of some of our courses, but not all of them at the PhD level are necessarily ripe for that just yet. What guiding principles can I use? And how can the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning help me with those kinds of day-to-day conversations? Where is the data? Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. I'm going to take us, I think, to yet another scale to consider. At my institution, which is Indiana University, at the behest of the president, we are in the middle, actually at the beginning stages, I suppose, of forming a new school of communication and media. And at its heart will be 3 departments. My department, Communication and Culture, which is a humanities department. The School of Journalism, which has a very long and storied past, history, and I think future. And then the Department of Telecommunications, which is in our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And we resisted this. All the faculty in all 3 departments resisted that for about 3 years, and then we got the word that resistance is futile. We will be a school. And one of the faculty will get together and will design a draft of what this school will be. And then, as the administration has told us several times, quite casually, that plan will then go out for review. The only reviewer so far to be named is Google. Google will review the new School of Communication and Media at Indiana University and other places like Google, apparently. So one might ask, what does Google know about teaching communication? What does Google know about the analysis of communication as constitutive of culture, culture unplugged, culture that is unplugged even while it is influenced by the kind of media that Google's interested in? How does culture in all of its manifold versions around the world make meaning out of these global technologies and what they send across those networks? Does Google have a vested interest in the kind of communication that we teach, how we define that to thousands of students every year? We've already had a demonstration at this conference of how Google Translator, which is a pretty remarkable device, how it translates scholarship. And it seemed to me to be pretty consistently calling that funding. I would probably call that something more like in-depth study intended for review, broad application by others, further improvement and development, again by others, for the sake of, mostly for the sake of greater accuracy and insight and engaged citizenship. But that wasn't what Google Translator gave us. So simultaneously with this move that is happening, we are told, and we believe, there's lots of talk about student assessment, learning outcomes, effective pedagogy. What will those be? And what is the role, again, of SOTL in that kind of move at the campus level? One sign of SOTL's success is that we get cited and recruited to give our thoughts on those sorts of initiatives. And indeed, I have been recruited to develop some sort of evaluation instrument that would presumably be used in the school. I have very much mixed feelings about that. How will, it's an opportunity, right? That influence, impact, now we can perhaps shape the way that teaching happens and have influence broadly over learning. There may well be lots of resources. I've heard Google has a lot of money. But what else happens? What sort of redirection happens? What kind of perception is there of scholarship of teaching and learning when it is being used very much as that kind of evaluation, that kind of assessment that we have taken great pains to distinguish ourselves from? And our administration and our colleagues who are not deeply involved in this conversation may well then see scholarship of teaching and learning as something that is rather oppressive and external to them, rather than having control over the questions, the data, the interpretation of that data, and the publication of it. This is going to be something else, apparently. So I'd like to bring our attention back to some of those early questions that we grappled with in ISSOTL discussions and other discussions that include thinking about culture, that include thinking of going beyond language to how people make meaning in language, how people develop practices together that shape the ways we live our everyday lives. That's a kind of, I think, looking to the past, not to go back, but to ground ourselves in the wisdom of the past as we go forward into this future, which, of course, is inexorable. We talked a lot in those early years, and we continue, I think, to talk about dissemination, or going public would be the other term that we use. And what is it that we think is going to be disseminated? What is it that is taken public? Are those theories? Are those instruments? And is there a way to think about it slightly differently? And I would do that through the lens of media theory and Henry Jenkins' idea of spreadability. Is there a way, rather than to think of dissemination, which is a kind of replication, or about going public, which is kind of a showing and hoping that people get it, but to spread the core ideas of scholarship of teaching and learning. And the question, so that they are variable, so that they are perhaps hopefully recognizable, but are not implemented in the same way. That phrase, scholarship of teaching and learning, is not translated directly into another language, but perhaps goes by other names with the same intent, and people around the world then can be our allies through that culturally sensitive, context-specific enactment of scholarship of teaching and learning. So can we think about ways that SOTL can be varied and spread at its core level across, and unpredictably varied across a variety of different contexts. The question I would pose to you all and my colleagues here is something along the lines of what is most important about scholarship of teaching and learning to spread? What are those core qualities, those questions, those identities that we would like to spread, and what are the forums that would best enable that kind of context-specific, variable, unpredictable spread of scholarship of teaching and learning that still allow us to have these very generative conversations?
During our email discussions, some months ago now, I think it was, somebody posed the question, could we respond to something that we read in a newspaper? And the thing that really leapt out for me was a pitch for a film called Looper, which is starring Bruce Willis, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and Emily Blunt. Some of you may have seen it. So a quote, "It's 2044 and the world is being governed by a mafia-like corporation with a firm grasp on posterity. Substitute the word university for the word world and you get a pretty grim picture of the future of higher education. Think about it. Increasingly, universities are being run by and are calling on corporations, and Jennifer's just given us an example of that, by bureaucrats, financiers, by accountants, people, in other words, who don't understand the nature of scholarly work. In fact, I don't know about your institution, your country, but where I come from in Australia, academic work is being taken out of the university. This is evident in the number of new institutions that are being set up. A couple of weeks ago, we were visited by Professor Mike Neary from the University of Lincoln in the UK, who was talking about a new social sciences study centre that's been set up in Lincoln. The centre has 83 academics signed up to it. It is providing degree-level qualifications, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the university. The centre occupies the city, and I choose that word in recognition of how it's become a popular in popular culture. This is taking academic study outside the university, and you can probably think of other examples. I recently came across the idea of the uncollege, which I think is a bit like Winnie the Pooh's unbirthday, you know, very merry unbirthday to you. So the uncollege provides a damning critique of current higher education with the caption, "You pay so much and you learn so little." A recent study of higher education, the future of higher education, which was interestingly commissioned by a consultancy firm who I think spoke to about 20 senior academics, I'm not sure, defined 5 mega trends for the future: contestability of markets and funding, global mobility, digital technologies, integration with industry, and democratization of knowledge and access. And I ask myself, where are the academics in this? Where are the faculty in this? Where do academics do their work these days? Do they do it in a noisy office, in a university? When did you last sit down to read a book in your office in working hours? No, we do our scholarly work at home and we do it in our own time. We take it out of the university. Those of us who spend our lives trying to open up opportunities for students to prepare them for a complex, multidisciplinary world where there are huge global problems to solve and where fear dominates local and global discourse. Is this the desired future for higher education? Can the scholarship of teaching and learning help us to create a different kind of future? Universities need to be re-established, I would argue, as places where scholarly work is done. Can we do this through intensification of the scholarship of teaching and learning? Some years ago, I argued that we need to develop universities as places where we work with our students and our professional and technical staff in inclusive, scholarly knowledge-building communities, where inquiry is central to how we communicate and to how we critically reflect on everything we do. This points to two directions, I believe, for the scholarship of teaching and learning. These are not new directions. I'm just echoing others who've written on these issues. One is that we have to involve students as partners in our teaching development and our scholarship. Reclaiming scholarly work in the university means that students have to be differently educated. It makes engaging students in the academic project of the university an imperative. The other direction is that scholarship of teaching has to be extended to look at all aspects of academic life, to provide the kind of critique of the sorts of forces which have been eloquently described by my colleagues on the platform. The scholarship of teaching and learning has to become the scholarship of academic practice. So my question to you is, how can we use the scholarship of teaching and learning to reclaim the scholarly life of the university?
Our intent was to deliver a lighthearted synthesis of the last few days and with uplifted hearts send you on your way, and I think we've done that. There's a lot to respond to, and you yourselves had conversation beforehand, and we'd like to open the floor, not just for questions, though we're happy to respond, but really for comment and for dialogue. I don't know if I'm holding the only microphone. Oh, no, she has it. There you go.
Is it working? Oh, nice. So yeah, I'm Torgny Roxo from Lund University, Sweden. We might have met throughout the conference, even though I have a hard time remembering faces. That's one of my personal problems. Thank you very much for this inspiring and sort of dreamlike vision of nightmare-like vision of. I would say that you're mirroring our discussion very much. We went into this direction almost as the first word we uttered around our table, and it was a very threatening one, very sort of threatening vision of the future. But the observation I would like to make here is that we are still talking about this, and we, I say us all, identifying myself with you up there, in a very teaching-like manner. We ask questions. So we ask questions to each other and trying to get ourselves to understand more things, and that's a very teaching-like way of dealing with things. I did, together with some colleagues in this conference, a panel on leadership in higher education. I also was part of a collaborative writing group on that very topic, where we concentrated on followership, a term which comes problematic in academic society. But what I would like to say is I believe that we have to go further. I don't think with a teaching endeavor we have in front of us, it's a political one. And I'm not sure that political discourses are really won by questions. They have to be answers. The problem again is to pose answers from an academic position is that we can guarantee that all our colleagues will deconstruct any solution for the future in the same moment that we have uttered them, and from very good standpoints. And I would suggest that that produces one of the biggest challenges for the entire community of global academia, is that we have to find strategies to become both political, choosing and put forward answers for the future, and critical at the same time. Because if we leave one and the other, as far as I can see, we're in big trouble. If we are not engaging politically in this, we will probably be overrun, and I like Angela's sort of harsh voice. I've never heard that before. Thank you for that. You may do that more often. More and more. In Sweden, there was a report released the other day claiming that it's called the price of freedom. And it's exactly what Angela points towards. Academics are increasingly doing their academic work in spare time between budget reporting and all other kinds of reporting they have to do in order to construct all that data that Randa is pointing towards. So again, I would just summarize this. I could probably go on for hours here. I won't do that. I think the main challenge is to learn ourselves, to teach ourselves to become both political and critical at the same time as a community, as a collective. And I find that to be a huge challenge to higher education. Thank you.
Others? There's one back there. Oh, we have multiple mics. Excellent.
Thanks. Vicki Moretsky from Indiana University. We're going through a reaccreditation in a portion of the school that I work in right now, and we're overwhelmingly dealing with the fact that what the employers of our students want are people who can do critical thinking, project management, and team management, both as leaders and as followers. And particularly those latter two, but I think also the former, also critical thinking, are things that are not particularly readily taught, even in a distance format to some extent, but certainly not in a me and my computer sitting in a corner practicing private sin kind of a context. And I think that to the extent that the world is going to continue to be an interactive place, interactive experiences, experiential learning, service learning, these kinds of opportunities are going to become more and more important for the educators who want to hire our students. Now, that doesn't help us with the people that we're trying to turn into new academics. If academia is going to go away, then that market is gone. But the larger group of our students are not going into academia. They're going out into the world, and the world wants people who can communicate and who can interact, and you cannot learn those things in a vacuum.
Joan right there, and then we'll come
Do
over.
we have two mics on the go? So one of the things that we learned, just before we get to the next point, one of the things that we learned in terms of this process is that if you hold your hand up, then the second mic can come to you and we can be a little more seamless with this. Thanks for those comments.
I'm Joan Middendorf from Indiana University. I really like thinking about being political, but I think we haven't quite said what our argument is that's going to be powerful that we're going to be political with. And I think until ISSOTL figures out what is the argument that's going to get people to want to invite us to decide what to do with the data and want to be at the table when people are designing the teaching and learning process at schools. I mean, they picked Jennifer because they know that she used to run the Teaching and Learning Center and she's been president of ISSOTL. I hope that's why they chose her. But mostly we might not be invited. We have to have some arguments that we can say this is what we are, this is what we bring, and I'm just not sure we've gotten to that place.
And actually, if I can get a mic. Hello? Do I have a microphone?
Number two.
These are all great comments. One of the things that we're planning for the next, beginning now, with ISSOTL, and I invite you, any of you, to join in this effort. Sherry Lincoln and I cooked up an idea to have an ad hoc committee that would consider public relations and policy, what did we call it? Advocacy and public relations for ISSOTL. That would be, we would have a multinational group and consider what that would look like, what tools we would need in order to do it well, what our messages might be that are common across countries or that would need to be more context sensitive. So if you are, I think Dan has some contact information, but if you wanted to contact Sherry or myself, we would love to have you on board to think about how to do this well.
Nicholas Simmons, Brock University. We had a lovely opportunity for compare and contrast. Here we have Canadians and UK contingent. And thank you for that question. Randy, that kind of triggered some stuff for us as we looked at how higher education is being assessed in an era of increasing accountability. And we were talking about the distinction between the systems where, and I apologize if I'm summarizing this a little too simply, but the notion that in Canada we've been looking at program review. It seems like the UK has added looking at how the educators are becoming professionals. And a colleague of mine talks about the distinction between the important and the imperative. And I think I'm certainly leaving with a sense of great urgency. In Ontario, we are really moving so quickly towards increased accountability. But I think there's an opportunity here to get a message to the government that assessing professors around their reflection, their inquiry on their teaching and learning practices as opposed to a moment in time of teaching evaluations. In other words, how are those people maybe engaging in SOTL might be a nice way to go. And I think the moment for that message is actually right now. So I wanted to thank the panel for prompting that thought.
Thank you.
I'm Jim Greer from the University of Saskatchewan. Randy's point drove home quite strongly, I think, the reality that organizations like this one are not the only voices for teaching and learning. There are many different voices, many different constituencies who believe that they have a corner on what teaching and learning ought to be, and the politicizing of teaching and learning, I think, also has many different forces, this society being just one small one of those. And I think that we have to recognize that organizations like this one and approaches like the approach that we take here is really one of the less influential at this moment in time. We would like to see it be more influential, clearly. And I think that Harvey's challenges yesterday were quite important in that respect about politicizing effectively. I think that's what he was talking about, is politicizing the scholarship of teaching and learning. And so I'm pleased to see this direction being taken in this conversation. There are certainly many challenges and many changing conditions, some big ones, and I think you've each identified key elements of that in your presentations here, and I think there are many more. I guess the question is, as a discipline, if we can call SOTL a discipline, do we have something unique to contribute? And I'm still not entirely convinced that we do. Any thoughts from the panel on that?
I do. Is that mic on? Can you hear me? Okay.
handheld's got to go.
One of my responses to the question of what do we have that's unique, that to me stitches through a number of the recent comments, I've been thinking about and writing a bit about the last couple of years, what I call the recentered curriculum, that portions of the formal curriculum are becoming much more visible as generic and interchangeable, and the explosion of online learning will make that even more so that I think that there's going to be a shift of investment to the portions of the curriculum that are high impact and integrative, that will be proven to be essential in order to produce the kinds of students, graduates, even for the workforce, as she was saying, who can work in teams and problem solve, et cetera. And I think the heart of our argument is around getting increasingly both rigorous and political about that high impact kind of experience as essential to measuring productivity and learning. And I think it's a large integrative argument that we need to make, and I think there is a lot of commitment among the work that we do to that kind of learning. It crosses boundaries to outside the academy, crosses boundaries to the political and the civic and the global. But it's an extremely fuzzy world that almost no money is being poured into versus the generic and interchangeable world. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being bet on the generic and interchangeable part of the curriculum, and very little money is being poured into the high impact integrative curriculum. And yet, there's lots of evidence that that's essential to the kind of productive graduates that, even those who talk about productivity, that's essential to that agenda. So I think that's a key part of what we have to offer.
Before we go to our shot, if I can add a word or two to that about what we have to add. The people in the workforce, the employers, as has already been pointed out, are continually telling us that our students need to be good critical thinkers, and we need to produce that. I think we have something to say about what critical thinking is. I think we have something more definitive, more helpful to say about what critical thinking is than some other sectors. And more to the point, I think we have something to say about how critical thinking is engendered or is not engendered. And so if that's what employers want, we can help with that, and I think we can help with that in ways that other sectors cannot. And I am struck by the contrast at times between what employers want and what the world needs. Going back to Natalie's comments from this table not long ago, when a couple of people bravely stood up behind her with a flag of the world, and she reminded us of what the world needs. Now, there's overlap between what employers want and what the world needs, but they're not exactly the same thing, and I'm wondering who's going to make that point. And I think we are one of the louder voices to make that point, and we need to make it in a scholarly way, not a ranting way, whether it be about global warming or about living together in the ways that Angela and others up at this table have talked about.
Excuse me?
Thank you. Thank you. I want to join the voices that we do have something to offer in a resounding way. First of all, just listening to the challenges that are posed, which were discussed on our table, we started with MOOCs, much like what you described, Randy, about the massive onslaught of data and the promise of these new pedagogies that are being claimed and questioned that. And also about governance, which Angela spoke to, that has shifted in many value-laden ways. And we also talked about intellectual property, but that's another discussion. And what I'd like to offer, I think, when we look at this as a way where boundaries are shifting and also being broken, the role I think we can play is one that we have played very well in the past, and that is the role of gatekeepers. Gatekeepers of learning. And we've done that, I think, very honestly in societies like this and in other societies that exist, including ISSOTL. I'd like to remind people there are 21 countries that get together and talk about issues like these and feel they need to be political as well about what to do. One of the things we do also very well is to design learning environments where good conversations occur. Maybe it's time that the conversations that are unfolding in the people who make policy decisions, the ones who are influencing the direction of future of higher education, maybe we need to design an environment where these conversations take place and engineer an atmosphere where we can be active participants. We may not have an argument, but we certainly know how
to convene an atmosphere where good conversations can take place.
Hi, I'm Dilly Fung from Exeter in the UK. I was particularly struck by Angela's comments about the academic and if you like, putting the academic back into the academy, which I thoroughly support. My feelings about the SOTL discipline or movement, whatever we might call it, is that it can become increasingly strong if it's increasingly inclusive of all of the excellent work that's going on right across higher education in a whole range of different disciplinary areas, and that if we can be richly inclusive of areas such as philosophy, anthropology, sociology, all the million subjects, well, thousands, probably tens at least, of many subjects right across higher education, that themselves have something very deep and very important to contribute to the question of teaching and learning in higher education, then as a movement we become much stronger and much more research-informed, evidence-informed, articulate and inclusive in the way that we can actually create arguments that will influence society and policy decisions.
So I guess a question I would like to add is, what kinds of role would we like to see our students play in this next decade? Is it as customer? I don't think so. Is it as learner? Is it as advocate for the work that we're doing? I think it's an important question, and it's an extension of what Angela brought up about how do we engage students. It was heartening to see so many sessions here addressing how we bring students in as partners, but I think we have to be very cautious of another agenda out there, another voice, as someone has already raised, that wants to think of them as customers only.
Can we turn it to Angela for a few remarks to bring us to a coda?
Is this the end?
Oh, it doesn't have to be. You can just make a comment.
I just want to make a comment.
Angela, turn it. Is this the end?
I want to make a comment about generations. Students' views of the university derive from their experience. And I think we forget that the politicians, the people who are collecting all this data, the bad guys, as it were, in our discussion, actually are products of universities by and large, which says something about many of our students go into industry or politics, and their ideas are coloured by their experiences. They make decisions about and statements about the nature of higher education that get fed into national policies. Some of the bureaucrats and accountants, as I've already said, end up in managerial positions in universities. Now, we know from research on students' awareness of research in the university that many of them are quite unaware that research actually takes place in the university. They're unaware of what their teachers do when they're not teaching them. So it's little wonder that when they have positions of power, that they basically think about, they don't think about the academic work that the academics do, because they don't have a sense of what that is. So I think, I've now got grandchildren, and my oldest grandson is 11 years old. And I think when we think about higher education of the future, we've got to stop thinking about where we are now and think about the next generation, because it's a generational thing. We are not going to change higher education for tomorrow or for the next 2 or 3 years, but we can begin to think, I think, in the much longer term, and then we can make perhaps a real difference.
Hello, my name is Niamh Kelly. I'm from the University of British Columbia, and it's interesting because my point follows directly from your point. And I was thinking one of the things that SOTL could do with these governing bodies, whether they're local, national, is point out the other side of the teaching coin. Because these governing bodies, when they look at the data, are just looking at the delivery. And I've been in online learning for years, and one of the things it's allowed me to do is to demonstrate to the learner their responsibility. And for instance, I have a course going on at the moment, and it's very what I would call learner-centered. They do a lot of self-directed work, they do a lot of group work, and I've, every year have a student who lets the group down and then emails me, and I just had one before I came here. Sorry, I was ill. You'll notice I was in the course every other week except this last one when I was ill, so I went back because I can get the data too and know that student wasn't in the course every day except when they were ill. And so there's a responsibility in the learner, and we can see this again with Rate My Teacher. There's this sort of, they're not accountable. They can make personal comments about me. They can do whatever. They could influence, thankfully I'm tenured. They can influence the path of the teacher. And yet we have not taken in a professional school like medicine, where I to do a rate your student before they get to the professional school, there's a little bit of an unevenness here, as that the governing bodies are putting it all on the delivery and not looking at the learner side. And I think it goes to Gary's point. We could sort of say we have a responsibility to educate the next generation in how they will lead the world. And so we need to bring them up in terms of their accountability, their responsibility, their leadership. And so it's a two-sided coin.
One or two more comments? There's one over here. Who's the closest mic?
Thank you. Margie McMillan from Mount Royal University, one of the phalanx of people here. I think one of the contributions of SOTL that we can make, just following on the last comment, is it allows us to be more transparent about our work in the classroom. If we are doing scholarship with our students based on learning and interventions in teaching, we're talking about that in our classroom. It's not doing scholarship to our students, it's doing scholarship with our students. And I think that may help with that 10, 15, 20 years down the road, if we can use that as a lever to be more transparent about all of our scholarly activities. And I like your point about that we need to look at the scholarship of academia. Scholarship of academic practice is an unfortunate acronym, so we might want to reconsider that. But if you go back to the Glassick, Huber, and Meroff work, that scholarship is what scholars do. And to be more transparent about all of our work in our classroom, it's no wonder the students don't appreciate what they don't know goes on. So thank you.
So Angela will offer a couple of thoughts, and then if we have a little exchange, or maybe one or more things from the audience, but now we're at the end, and the coda.
The coda, thanks. I just want to, there's no conclusion to a conversation like this. We'll all take different things from it. I just want to pose perhaps a few paradoxes that I've picked up in our conversation as we've gone along. And perhaps the first one is the one that Torgny proposed, that we should become better at providing answers, but actually we're very good at asking questions. We've also talked quite a bit about the role of data and technology, and in contrast, higher education as people-centered, as focusing on the people, the students, the academics. And it reminds me of a tension which Ron Barnett points to, which is the tension between epistemology and ontology. He says that we need to think more about the being of the student and not so much about the knowing of the student. And I think that tension, that there's a kind of paradox there. We've also talked about the education as a public act and the public act of politics and how we speak to power. But we've also talked about the private, what happens in the classroom. I think one of the things that traps us, and there was quite a bit about, the development of criticality earlier in our discussion, we're, I think, trapped by the paradox that we're asking students often to develop skills of criticality and of communication that we as academics, as faculty, don't have. Many of our academics are asked to address graduate attributes that they themselves don't possess. Perhaps another paradox that I think we've talked about is that we're endeavouring to move forward, but we're constantly trapped by tradition. Now, I've got a whole list of these paradoxes, but I'm going to stop there because I think those are the ones that I've particularly heard, in the conversations that we've had this morning. Is it morning or afternoon?
It was.
We're right on the cusp, so your confusion is well warranted.
Sorry. Just to say, well, how do we go forward with the scholarship of teaching and learning in this scenario? Sorry.
I would just quickly add, and then invite Gary and Jennifer to say something in response and more, that at least one other paradox that I think about in the context of this kind of conversation is that the scholarship of teaching and learning as it was formulated in the early 90s in some ways looked backward at a kind of scholarship that was trying to replicate and legitimate itself by, and it was also fashioned by the notion that it was individual faculty inquiring into their own practices. And although we've developed a number of wonderful collaborative practices and a community around that individual work, it's still collaboration and community around an individual paradigm of work. And one of the paradoxes I think suggested by many of these challenges is that we may need to refashion ourselves around things that we value in our inquiry that are not built on an individual paradigm of inquiry, a much more multiple, team-oriented, scalable kind of inquiry that still retains the values at the heart of the kind of inquiry that we do. And I think that's both a paradox and a challenge.
I would just add to that I was thinking of the phrase stepping back from the data for a bit. We're in there grappling with it so much. But I think these meta-discussions about our field and the larger context are crucial so that we're not just going ahead blindly. So I would encourage these kinds of discussions in the future.
I find it deliciously ironic on some level that we sit here just now in terms of weather patterns just outside the edge of a hurricane. And I'm reminded that, we can try to take charge of these things in some ways. And the last thing that I'm thinking in light of Randy's comments about his experience with the event he attended is, if the corporate world wanted to address the kinds of questions we're addressing now, where do we need to be in 10 years, would they do it the way we just did it over the last 90 minutes? I don't know for sure. I don't want to guess necessarily, but I would be pleasantly surprised if they did. And then I ask, well, why did we do it this way? Why did we have people fairly quickly express views, pass it over to a larger group, have them express, come back and forth? We do this in part because of our identity, I think, but we do it also because I think we believe, and we have good reason to believe, this is a good way to learn. We do things differently, and we do them differently for good reason, and I think we need to hold on to that and push it forward. That will be my source of optimism going away from Hamilton.